It's all fine. All right, so welcome to Medieval Illumination in the Painting Cool Art in the SCA. This is my introduction to illumination in the SCA as a whole, which is useful if you're new to the SCA completely, or if you've been around for a while, but you're new to illumination and you've just been looking to get into it. It's mostly an informative class, but feel free to ask questions about anything Scribble as we're going along or as you see things. Can everybody see the PowerPoint? Is that still being shared?
Yes, it is.
All right, so illuminated art in the SCA. Now, of course, you know, we don't have many entirely illuminated books in the SCA. I won't say none because, you know, even locally, you know, Master Isaac is a bookbinder and has done entire books. But we don't have many. So what do we use Scribble in the SCA for? Big question. Before printed book illustrations, of course, every book that had images had unique hand-painted designs. And pictures, sometimes they were illustrating events, sometimes they were illustrating stories or allegory. You had fun marginalia, the little animals, you know, hiding in the borders, doing things like jousting snails. This was the way to make things interesting and beautiful. So historically, this starts mostly with religious texts, and related works get this treatment first because they're the first things people are producing in mass in any way, shape, or form. And most of those are the reproduced works early on. And religious houses, monasteries, churches are the ones originally produced, doing most of the production. As you get into the later periods and people start actually commissioning books, and you start to see layman's books and stories that are not religiously based being published and widely read as literacy goes up, you start to see scribal houses, you know, and guilds doing work on commission outside of the church as well. So over time, this expands. You see more secular work, a wider variety of styles and pieces. So this also includes other types of documents when I'm talking about scribal, because we think of the illuminated, but the scribing is, of course, the actual written text and the calligraphy. So this is other types of documents as well. And this is where this comes into the SCA, because one of the places you still see a lot of illuminated and scribal pieces is they are official words from the monarch. For example, Her Majesty, the Queen of England, still has a herald and a scribe and has official artists who still do proclamations. And they're beautiful. So in the SCA, when the crown or a noble is giving recognition to a member of their populace in the form of an award, or they've won a competition and sometimes there's a scroll to, you know, commemorate that as well, that comes with the illuminated scroll with the text on it, you know, saying this person has achieved this victory, this person has earned this honor, has demonstrated skill in this area, and they are being officially recognized. So it's actually very cool. It's pretty. People hang them on their walls. They are functionally legal documents because they are the evidence of that, you know, physically in person, as they would have been in the Middle Ages. So that is what we're doing as scribes and illuminators in the SCA, is creating these documents and making them look awesome. So there are a couple of different ways that this production happens. You have a lot of pieces that are entirely original work from start to finish, which is, you know, as it would have been done in the Middle Ages, in the Renaissance, in many cultures. This is not just Europe, but they often you run into, in some kingdoms, and this varies by kingdom in the SCA, we have very, very generous rulers and sometimes not as many artists to keep up with the generosity of our rulers. And so some kingdoms have pre-printed blanks for some of the most commonly given out awards that are available, that are painted, you know, we call them charters. In some kingdoms like to call them preprints. They're the same thing. And it's just the text and the outline. And then, you know, you get to take your paint and you fill it in and you paint it. Like the ones I was using in my previous class as examples. The one here on the screen is an sample from our Scribal website of one of our charters. And it's basically like a coloring page on really great paper designed for watercolor at that point. But they are still, going to get the unique art treatment of having an original paint job. And they're all by a wide variety of artists, so they never look exactly the same. And some people will add a little something to them, or do something different with them. And then they're different, and they're a great place to start, especially if you're just getting started in as an artist or as a scribe, because it gives you a chance to practice the techniques without having to also know already how to do all of the drawing and all of the calligraphy and everything right at the beginning. So some people come in knowing some of these things. Many of us don't. I had never touched a scroll before I joined the SCA. I hadn't drawn anything medieval. I did not know how to do calligraphy. So it's a great place to start. And Aura has a lot of these. We've got over 90 something designs between all the different awards that we give out in this kingdom. But the big things like the peerage scrolls, the nobility scrolls, there are things we always do completely original. So the nice thing about doing this in the SCA is you have the option to start with charter painting. You can also learn all of these skills from other scribes in the SCA. So if you want to learn to do calligraphy, we can teach you calligraphy. If you want to learn how to paint something specific like Celtic or Han Dynasty Chinese, you can find somebody who knows that particular skill set and that particular period and examples, and they can show you, different things. So you have a lot of options there. If you want to learn how to do the drawing, we can teach you the drawing. But there's, several parts to the design of a scroll overall. And then there's also the simpler, place to start. So here are just some other examples that I wanted to pull up of painted charters. This one of the first one here, of course, is the sample we were just looking at, but in color. And you can see how that's been colored in. And the one next to it is a blade of merit. And that one's there as well. And you'll notice, there's a few things on here you'll notice they're colored in, there's detail work on them, but these are, of course, from the crown. So they are the words of the crown, official, but they're really pretty, and there are dozens of different ways to paint these. So they are pretty awesome. And there are a lot of people teaching all the time. I teach multiple classes. So if you are interested in something specific that I know, I am happy to teach anybody anything that I actually know. It does not have to be at a collegium. You can come to Scribal Night. Bees and Foyer actually has their Scribal Nights right now every Tuesday, and they're virtual. We've been doing that ever since the pandemic started. They went online, so or we can meet online and talk anytime. But there's a wide variety of examples on here of different levels. You will notice that the amount of art is generally indicative of the level of the award. The AOA level awards tend to have a piece kind of like this, where they've got a bar and some illumination, but it's like one side of the page mostly. Whereas back here on this grant, the Blade of Merit, which is the Rapier grant, is multiple sides. It's a little fancier. So we've got a lot of great examples of different ways to paint it. Everything has its own style. And so when we're doing this, of course, there's supplies. And I know there's often a lot of questions about supplies. So we are going to go over this part here. Different things you need. Paintbrushes. The smaller the paintbrush, often the better in some ways. These are going to be very small if you're used to painting with larger brushes. On the sizes on them, if you're looking at a brush, I have a brush over here somewhere. I will pull them out in a bit and we'll look at some of my stuff. But the ones that are size 0 or smaller are going to be your friend. You're looking for something that is either going to be a liner or a pointer or a spotter, something with a nice smooth with a small tip. A very good tip on a brush is very important. Now, these do not have to be expensive, and they do not have to necessarily be medieval accurate, especially when you're starting out, because honestly, some of the modern inexpensive ones you can get that are, are fine as long as it has a good tip on it. They're actually sometimes, and they're much easier to work with than some of the period brushes. I've tried working with boar bristles. I'm not sure who thought those were a great idea, but people have painted with them. I prefer squirrel. Squirrel is much more like the modern brushes. In fact, I ordered some squirrel brushes from England for a project at one point because I was doing a very period piece for somebody and wanted to just try them out. If there are questions, please feel free to just talk.
I've heard that gouache, however you say it, gouache is typically one of the more period modern paint types. Like it gives a better look than like acrylic or anything.
Okay, yes,
That is
gouache.
what I've heard.
And we are going to discuss that in detail here in just a minute. So yes, we're going to talk
Yay.
about gouache.
Okay.
All right. So paintbrushes, like I said, anything that's small and has a good tip on it will work for you. You can get sable, you can get something period if you really want to, especially if you're just starting out. I recommend just some of the basic, fine tip ones you can find in any art supply store. Sometimes they sell, little sets of them. This is the Fine Touch set from like Hobby Lobby. It happened to be where I got these. They have a nice tip on them, but they're fairly small, and all that really matters is that nice fine tip on them for control. These are gold nylon. They're completely synthetic, but they work really well and they're fine. Unless you're really worried about doing a completely period piece with completely period materials, they will work just as well as anything you would be using. You'll need something blank to paint. You'll need something to paint. I or a regional officer or whoever your local guild head would be there are plenty of people you can contact to get a hold of things to paint. You will need water in a cup. I, of course, recommend changing this out often because the minute your water starts taking on tinges of other colors, it's going to start messing with your paints. So when you're painting, I recommend painting like do all of your reds, then clean out your water cup. Do your blues, clean out your water cup. Clean your brush really well between colors, or you're going to have that problem we all had as children where your colors all start to look kind of brown. Don't want to do that. This is my water cup. You can use anything. If you're at home, you can use a paper cup. I like this little friend of mine because it is small, so I have to remember to change it often. It is ceramic, so it's fairly heavy and it doesn't tip over easily. And I'm never going to mistake this for my cup of tea or my soda because it's a completely different shape. And we've all known, if we've all been painters, that your paint mug and your drink mug should never look the same or be one that you've used for the other because you will have a very bad day. So I like, yeah, go ahead.
I was going to ask, I was told to get super tiny brushes for mine, and I ended up hunting high and low and found these. I don't know if you can, are those too small?
All right, there's no such thing as too small.
Okay, because I was looking at yours and looking at mine like, oh, did I get the wrong brushes?
Oh, no. Yours are more like what I normally get. This was my sample class set. The brush I was using in my previous class, which has walked away for the moment, is a 20-aught. It is about as tiny as you can get commercially, though I did find 30-aughts once. And those are my favorites. The sizing on brushes, once it goes smaller than 0, it starts to give you a number over 0. And that means it's even smaller on the side of your brush. It's going to tell you your brush size.
Oh, so it'd be like 20 over 0.
20 over 0 is a 20-aught, and that is a very tiny brush. That is my favorite size.
Oh, okay.
So no, you can't actually get too small. But if you're trying to fill larger areas, sometimes it's nicer to have a bigger brush for like filling the solid color areas that are big.
Okay.
Otherwise, you're spending forever with a little tiny brush. Those are great for details. They're amazing. So you've got your water, you've got brushes, you've got something to paint. Paper towels. I have paper towels right here. I've been using them today. These are important for multiple reasons. One, cleaning your brush, because even when you rinse it out, you need to wipe it off. Two, avoiding getting paint and skin oil on the piece you're painting. Because skin oil on your piece, if somebody has to put calligraphy on there later, it's gonna fan everywhere. So when you're painting, if you need to put your hand down on the paper to reach something, make sure that, well, first off, make sure where you're putting it down is dry. Put paper towel on your piece, hand on the paper towel. We'll keep that from happening. We'll also keep you from accidentally smudging things. Always have paper towels of some, you know, I guess you could use a real towel, but really you're going to want to throw it away, and you're going to like paper towels are the best option. You can also use like just another piece of paper if you're worried about your hand on paper. But for cleaning, always, or if your water spills, just always have paper towels at the ready. They are your best friend. And now we're going to talk about paint, because we had questions here about gouache, which is how it's pronounced. It's French. So yes, it looks really weird, but that's why it's pronounced gouache. Now, gouache is specifically, often on modern stuff, I've seen it also referred to as opaque watercolor, which is more of a description of what it is. And it's been making a very popular comeback in modern art lately. Like there's been a whole bunch of new brands coming out of gouache. So it's easier to find, though the quality varies dramatically, than it used to be. Now, gouache is specifically, and the reason we use it is, yes, it does most appropriately and correctly approximate behavior of period pigments. It's the same ingredients. It is, you know, it's a binder and liquid and pigment. So it is just the modern incarnation of period scribal paint. It is opaque because it has an opaque base added to it to allow that layering effect that we get when the colors are dry, and you can put like white on top of blue and it doesn't just all blend together. And in period, that would have been either chalk or slaked plaster. And that's still often used because it just gives it that, because they take pigment really well, but they're not, you don't get that transparency like you get with the traditional watercolor. And it's now, and then of course, the part that's not period is if they are using a synthetic color creation, because as we know, the vast majority of old pigments in a lot of your bright colors were toxic because they were made out of cadmium. Is actually made out of cadmium. You had lead in your white. There's an arsenic yellow. You could cook your lead to get oranges and reds. And they were playing with a lot of things you really don't want to mess around with all the time necessarily in your house. A lot of greens come from oxidized copper and are incredibly toxic. But a lot of them were plant-based and were fine, but you have these things. So a lot of modern incarnations of perfectly accurately period looking colors will be made chemically and in a way that is less toxic, which is where they're not always entirely period, but they work the same way as the period paint. There's nothing medieval about acrylic. It is a modern incarnate. It is a modern creation. And it will not give you the effects you want, and it will dry out and you can't reconstitute it. So it has many great and wonderful other uses. This is not where you want to use your acrylics. But gouache is the thing. Now gouache, fortunately, because of this comeback, there are perfectly usable tube sets inexpensively. Yes, don't use acrylic on scrolls. That are not super expensive. And I've got them on here because I've tested all of these. There are a lot of the best ones, and people will argue best. The most commonly known brands of gouache out there, Winsor & Newton is very popular, which if you've ever been in an art store, they also do regular watercolor and oils and all sorts of things. It is much cheaper to buy Winsor & Newton off of either an art supply store like Dick Blick or in like a Michael's than it is to order from their website, because they're in Europe and you want to get it from a company that's already paid the fees to bring it into the country, so you're not paying for crazy shipping. They're also cheaper if you buy them from one of the US suppliers, but they are a little more expensive. They're, $5 or $6 for a tube, whereas these, like Hobby Lobby has the Master's Touch, brand and run of art supplies. They have a gouache. You can get their 24 color set for $20, and almost every color in there is actually a medieval color. There are a couple that are modern, but almost all of them are usable. The same is the Royal and Langnickel brand, which I've actually seen at Walmart for 24 tubes of basically the same set for $16. So if you're just learning, these are easy to use, functional paints, and you don't have to spend $6 a tube if you're just getting into this. Now, I will say, the thing I have always noticed with art supplies is the higher the grade of the supply you're working with, the more satisfied eventually you're going to be with your results. So if you decide you really want to get into this, I recommend the Winsor & Newton. There are several other brands that if we want to talk about those at some point, we can. I don't have a list immediately in front of me, but there are several. Schmenke is another good one that are available as well. What you really need is a very basic set of colors to start. When you're picking your colors, you're going to want a good, pure, solid white, a kind of a deep reddish red, a blue that's more of a cobalt, like a deep blue. And I'll pull out my paints here in a little bit and show you some examples. A deep green, more of a foresty green, or a more natural looking green, not like neon green. A nice golden yellow. We live in Onsteora and Vinheim. A good dark golden yellow is kind of essential. And then, so not Crayola yellow, and a good purple and a black. When black is mostly something you're going to use for tinting stuff darker if you want to do some shading. Or if, because we're in Onsteora and Vinheim, you're coloring in heraldry and there's like big black splotches in places in there. So, and eventually a metallic gold, because of course Illumination is named because of the gold leaf that they used. And so that's the big thing. So,
what are your thoughts on the Arteza brand?
Arteza, I have never actually used Arteza.
Okay.
So I can't actually express an opinion on it myself.
I was gifted a box of 60 and I haven't opened them yet. So.
Well, then I would say open them and give them a try. If they work, awesome. If not, let us know.
Okay.
There's always brands out there and you just don't know till you try them. And some people will swear by one brand where other people hate them. So if it works for you, just use it, I recommend these because I've had consistently good results with these beginner brands more than some of the others. Like I would never recommend Reeves to anybody. Please do not buy Reeves. You will be very sad and you will be fighting with your paint, and that doesn't make it a good time for you or your product.
What was that? Don't buy what?
Reeves, Reeves. They do watercolor and they do gouache. They're very inexpensive, like practice paints for students. I've tried them. They're not good for getting like a nice smooth cover on anything, and they're very finicky. At least where I am. It could be that in different weather and conditions they may be better, but I've had a lot of people complain about them. And if you're going to be fighting with your materials, you're not learning, because you shouldn't have to fight with the stuff that you're working with. So
the next line says this gold set.
Yeah, and that would be, and that's referring to I had to rearrange the one at the top, the gold set, that is at the top of the slide. It was at the bottom of the slide, and then I changed computers and my slides were fighting me this morning. The Calero here at the top is handmade in Germany. These, and I have these, are mica-based metallics. And which by the way, when they needed cheater gold period, they did sometimes base them off, use mica. So this is not an unperiod concept. These are in fact from Germany, that you can get them in the US. They're about $25 for a set, but the gold lasts a really long time. And they get multiple shades of gold. And this set I like because it also has a silver. And they did in fact use silver occasionally in the Middle Ages along with gold leaf. Now, the reason you never see that really well is of course because it tarnishes horribly, because they would use actual silver. So often when you're looking at an old document and you see gold and then you see what looks like horrible dark black bleeding everywhere, it's because they used real silver. if you use the mica-based silvers, they don't tarnish because it's mica, not actual silver, but it will look as if you used silver leaf. So I recommend these because silver, bless it, as much as I love silver, it's not going to work. And there was a great comment here earlier that I wanted to address about how.
Say the Winsor Newton gold and silver are both also mica based.
Yes, they are as well. These have more pigment than the Winsor Newton. I mean, I've used the Winsor Newton, they're both perfectly fine. These have more pigment in them, which means I find I have to do far fewer layers with these. These have been very popular, especially locally, but I've all over the kingdom. The first time I saw these was somewhere down in Houston, like 15 years ago. The brand used to be called Finetech, and Finetech, there was apparently a few years ago some politics in the brand industry. Finetech changed their name to Caliro, and there was some splitting in the brands, and so now there's another company that's still called Finetech that also makes this kind of gouache, but it's not the original company. So if anybody's been around for a while and is looking for the original company that was Finetech, it's now Caliro. So because when I was looking to get a new one because I was almost out of my paints after a decade, I was like, oh, they've changed brands, and I went and looked some stuff up. But there was a wonderful comment here about the difference between gouache and period pigment, and it depends on how you mix your paint, because having mixed period pigments, depending on how you mix your period pigments, you might as well be using gouache. It depends a little bit on the color. It does depend on the color, because if you're using like a plant-based, the plant-based ones tend to be a little more translucent. The color's a little different. So there are some differences, yes. For some of them, there's very little. It also depends on how good you are at grinding your pigment, because the finer you can grind it, if you're making it yourself, the more it will have that smooth quality of modern paint, because they have machines to help grind everything. But yes, there can be some texture differences, especially when you're starting out making your own pigments or using period pigments. I've had the pleasure to use some where there was basically no difference, because we have several people who do make their own, and they're wonderful, and they teach classes in it. But yes, there are some differences depending on which one. Yes, and the silver, it depends on where they did it. Most of them you're going to see gold. Sometimes you see silver depending on where you are. But I love the ones with silver. Yes, acrylic is bad. Acrylic is wonderful on other kinds of projects, but it is not a historical paint. It is modern, it is plasticky, and you're gonna have issues with it doing what you need to do. For one thing, it doesn't layer the same way. It doesn't reconstitute when you get it wet, because once it's dry, and it dries very quickly. It's thicker, so you can't do layering techniques the same way. There are just a lot of things, but I love acrylic paints. I do a lot of mixed media stuff, not on a medieval scroll, not on the type of paper we're using. It's not designed for it. It's a totally different purpose. For these, we're looking at something that's at least vaguely, historical. I have used acrylics on other things, many other things, but just not in illumination.
Not a thing.
So no good, right? Exactly. Yes, I'm glad you've been doing reading. Reading is important.
I have everything.
Okay, the watercolors. All right, tell me where you're going as acrylic. Okay, so, and again,
Yes,
that
ma'am.
set that I showed you is useful. The Caliro set, I've actually seen them on Amazon.
I probably am not going to be there
Mary,
tomorrow.
can you please mute? Thank you. All right, so gouache is a watercolor paint. So anytime you use it, you're going to be adding a little bit of water. When you buy it fresh out of the tube, it is wet, yes, like a normal paint, and it's going to be thicker. So yeah, you're going to want to add a little water to thin it out. When it sits, it is eventually going to dry completely out. And that's what it does, because it is a watercolor. Now, the nice thing about a watercolor, and I'm going to hold this, actually, here, let me do this on the big camera, as I have a camera, is it's eventually going to dry out completely. And this one, I've used this one a lot. I tend to end up with like deep divots in my paint. But this is my cadmium red. It is dry. So I reconstitute this every time I paint. But the nice thing
Okay.
is it doesn't go bad. It doesn't mold.
When you get it out of the tube, do you have to empty the whole tube or else it dries in the tube as well?
No,
Okay,
you're
because I was
fine.
like, there's no way I would be able to go through all
Also,
that paint.
if it dries in the tube, you just cut the tube off. You just take the tube off and use the paint. Unlike watercolors, you know, unlike oils or oil-based paints, the watercolor-based paints are very forgiving because they are designed to survive this way. They come in a different types. They're different. I mean, they come in different consistencies. Some of these, and these came in tubes originally. Some paints come dry. I will actually pull this out for you right now. This is one of those sets that I was talking about. These are literally little pallets of completely dried out pigment. They come this way because they store better this way. And you don't get a huge mess, right? When I cover this, when I turn it upside down.
So pretty.
And if you look at the depth of these, I love these metallics. I love these in particular because there is so much pigment in them. We talk about this a lot. The quality of a paint and the cost of a paint, the primary reason the professional paints cost more is they have more pigment in them compared to the rest of what's in the paint. A higher quality paint will have a higher percentage of the color and pigment in it, which is what you want. Because, you know, does anybody remember painting with watercolor paints in elementary school? Where they would give you that lovely little palette of what looked like beautiful dark colors, and you could not, there's almost no pigment in them. That's why they're cheap. The major difference between most of your qualities of paint is going to be the amount of pigment for cost, which is why the higher end ones will often be more satisfying, and you get those beautiful deep solid colors, and you only have to do like 1 or 2 layers, you know, maybe a touch up rather than layering on it over and over. But these, like I said, if you look for Caliro on like an art website, michaelsdickblick.com is a big one. They're an art supply company. I've seen these on Amazon. If you Google Caliro metallic watercolor, you'll have better luck on a search. But yes, the Winsor Newton brand metallics are also usable. Schmenke does a really nice gold. They're a German company as well. A lot of the really good stuff comes out of Europe if you're looking for gouache, which is why I also provided you a couple of inexpensive American options. All right, scrolling, scrape something into a palette. All right, there's a lot of good stuff. I use water. You always use water. They are water-based paints. You always don't want to use mineral anything. You don't want to use alcohol. They are water. So paper. Okay, you can't print charters yourself. That's not allowed. You can print, like, if you want to print stuff off to practice on, that's on you. You cannot print an on-steering charter. The Kingdom gets their paper from a professional supplier, and there's a quality assurance policy in place there where only people who are approved and have copies of the master copies are allowed to print them. If you're looking for what's a good weight of paper to use for projects, there are several. Like Arch's watercolor paper, hot press watercolor paper from any art store, whether it comes in a palette or the big pieces, is great. We use, for our actual paper, an 80-pound weight paper is what the Kingdom is currently using if you've ever seen the charter paper that we have. That is an 80-pound weight natural paper. Because you want something that works well with watercolor. So, I mean, if you're just practicing, actually the linen papers they use for resumes are great for practice. If you can find them without a watermark, that's better. Often those have watermarks on them. But those are great papers for practice. And then there's some great questions in here. I've seen people use Bristol board. I don't personally use it. It's a modern surface I'm not a huge fan of, but lots of people like it. It works well for certain things and designs. And then there are a variety of options. Our kingdom also has a parchment project where they actually make parchment out of deer hide. So if you're working on something for the kingdom, you can request pieces of parchment to actually play with and use and work on period surface. It does not have to be paper. I do not scrape paint out of my palette. I don't use a palette because this is my palette, this lovely little box. I just stick my brush in here with my water and go. Because if I'm blending a color, which is, I'm going to be pre-blending most of my colors. For example, I do have multiple shades of this color. But what I have is, so here, let me lay out a little sample here of my pre-blended mix. I had this color of red. For tinting, I mixed a little black in to make a darker color. And then for the highlights, I have a couple of different shades mixed lighter. And a lot of artists do this. If you're comfortable mixing colors, like if you have color theory and you can mix, awesome. But the only thing you're ever going to be mixing with a color in period, except for the Middle East, because they didn't care if things were toxic and mixed things irreverently. They were crazy and awesome. Is there, because remember when we mentioned a lot of things had chemicals and toxins in them? There are a lot of things you don't want to cross, and they learned them through trial and error. A lot of medieval paint is chemistry. So there were colors they never mixed and blended because they caused, gases that would knock people out or, mess with people's heads. So you get these colors. I pre-mix mine for shading. But a lot of what's going to happen is you're going to be putting like white directly on top of another color to get a highlight. So I don't use a palette because I have no real use for one. I have pulled out a little palette before if I had to make while I was mixing a new color, but I found that because they're watercolors, they often pop off of plastic surfaces that are like the flat palettes you buy at like art stores. So that's another reason I like these, is because they can't fall out of these. They stick better to these little cups that I have. Although I've used some other plastic palettes with lids before too. Okay, other questions? Yeah, I mean, you can use any watercolor paper, especially if you're just practicing and you want to try it out. Absolutely. Hot press works better, but cold is fine too for practice. It doesn't work as well for calligraphy because the hot press has a finer grain and it doesn't feather your calligraphy ink as badly, which is the primary reason for the hot press versus the cold. But yeah, you can get those at any art supply store if you're just trying to go get paper to practice on. And they do come in pads. Exactly. Awesome. Yeah, the mica paints, all the paint is just add water. It's pretty simple. Okay. And this all kind of comes into that last thing on my point here, which was paint palettes and holders. There are as many different ways to hold your paint as there are artists in the SCA. So really the answer is what works for you. There are a lot of different palettes. I recommend things with lids because, like I said, they tend to pop off of plastics because they don't adhere a whole lot. And you want to be able to access those, without them falling out. These are my, these are actually, weirdly enough, these little guys are bead holders for like seed beads from like Joann's. You can get them online and like Amazon. It's a kit. Here, like, it's a box. Let me get back to my kit. It is literally a box full of little screw-on lids. I got those little round stickers and stuck them on here myself to label what color was in them. But they are useful. They keep your paint's not likely to mold in here. You do want to keep them airtight when, so they don't mold, so they don't do things. That said, if you get mold on one because it's really humid, you can just scrape it off and keep using the paint. It's not going to ruin your paint if you scrape a little off. But yeah, anything, we've got an example. All right, let me look at this question here. Open, please. Somebody asked about a specific makeup kit for a source. Let me take a look. For holding colors. Okay, so much stuff on my screen. Little magnetic Okay. It's not showing up on my screen. Hold on. Down. I mean, yeah, I mean, yes, I've seen people use the little metal ones as well. So you can use the little metal ones. I know a lot of people who use those too. So those are also an option, but yeah, anything that will hold your paint in. You can get one of those little palette boxes that has a lid and little, you know, dips in them to use them. But the more open the tray is, the more likely you're going to have little chunks of dried paint bouncing around. So I like something that keeps them very separate. It's just easier on yourself later. And that whole box with like 36 or something ones in it, this was $8. So they're not expensive. And I always recommend, I try to recommend things that are inexpensive if you're going to get started in this hobby, because it's one, I get like most of the hobbies in the SCA, you can spend a little money or a whole lot of money, depending on how into it you get. But I like those in particular. These, I say, you can find some like this at Walmart. I've seen them a little bit bigger at Walmart. These I got at Joann's. I have seen very similar ones like directly on Amazon, but they are bead organizers. So they come in a variety of sizes. You just want to make sure that if you're looking at it, it's these little ones, because sometimes they have like, you know, big jars. You want to look for one that's like enclosed. And I like this because I can turn this upside down. I can put it sideways in a box, and my paints are still going to be in order when I open them up later. So it's helpful. All right, what else is in here? Is that a little bit here? And there's a picture of part of my kit. For calligraphy, I only touch on calligraphy a little bit here because as a beginner class, you know, there are all sorts of other classes just on calligraphy supplies. If you're interested in learning calligraphy, the best things to practice with there are cartridge calligraphy pens you can buy where you can just put the ink cartridges in and try them. The felt tip ones are not ones you're going to want to use on actual projects, but a good beveled tip is great for practicing your strokes as far as like getting angles correct. That said, if you can move to something with a metal nib or a quill, but a metal nib like the modern cartridge pens or something sooner, it helps with not developing bad habits, because calligraphy pens only move, you can't go up with the pen or you're gonna like rip into paper. Almost all strokes are down. So with the felt tip pens, you wanna make sure that you're also practicing your strokes in the right direction. So I would recommend going to an actual calligraphy teacher, and we have several of those. You know, Ian was mentioned earlier. Ian the Green is a phenomenal calligrapher, and he actually teaches classes online. Like almost every week, there's another class on another hand, and there's a whole Facebook group devoted to calligraphy that he's got, and it's wonderful. So, but if you're looking for stuff to get started in calligraphy, the cartridge pens are a great place to start if you don't want to spend the money and try and figure out dip pens and ink. And the book I have up here is Mark Drogan's Medieval Calligraphy, Its History and Technique, which is kind of the like standard biblical starting calligraphy book in the SCA. One of a couple that exist. It's been around for a long time, and it shows you how to make the different strokes for the different medieval styles of calligraphy specifically. A lot of calligraphy books are very modern. If you know, when you're looking online and they're like calligraphy made easy, they're modern hands, they're not historical. So if you're wanting to do something that goes with a historical piece you're looking at, or the things that we're doing, you want to, you know, use the hands. You know, modern day, you know, we have fonts. These were hands. That's basically like saying medieval font, because they had specific, you know, unique styles that would be used. But they're all a little different depending on who was writing them, because everybody's hand is a little bit different. So that's a great place to start. Okay, are there any other questions? There's been a lot of amazing questions in here so far.
I have a silly question.
You have a silly question?
I do.
Okay.
At least I feel like it's silly.
Well, what's your question?
So a while back, you said this is my cadmium red. Do you actually use like a cadmium ink? Or is that just like the color?
Well, this is cadmium red, which is to say that which at that point, you can look at, right, is the question here, I'm gonna verify, is the question here, is this actually cadmium, or is the question
Yes.
here, is there also red? All right, well, Winsor Newton cadmium colors, if you ever want to know, most of these companies, if you go to their websites, they have the actual chemical sheets for each color because they're required to, they have to be approved. There's a whole process, and and so yes, most of the ones that are cadmium, you want to check and see if it's a synthetic color that is matching cadmium or if it's really cadmium. I believe my Winsor Newtons are actually cadmium, because cadmium is used for reds, oranges, and yellows often, and it is not as toxic as many of the others. So it is one they don't necessarily always synthesize. I have a bunch of period pigments, and then I have a bunch of completely modern things because, for example, a lot of the greens that are based out of copper, if anybody's ever messed with oxidized copper, it's incredibly toxic. And so when I was researching period greens, I went online and spent a whole lot of time looking at the chemical compositions of modern paints and researching and going, so who made what to replace this color? And found, which brands had come up with equivalent non-toxic versions. So I have some of both. That's actually a great question. Okay, and we have a hand up. Is this the same question that's in the chat?
No,
Okay.
I've actually, it's a comment more than a question.
Go
if I
ahead.
may. I've actually seen a few people in the SCA work with oxidized copper to make green paints, but they do it with 3 layers of gloves, ventilation.
Exactly. Oh, there are plenty of people
things like they never touch it.
I have 5 cats, and I don't have a good ventilated room in my house where I can keep out animals, so I don't make it myself. But yes, I know plenty of people who do. I know lots of people who make their own pigments. I've made a few, just not that one.
I wasn't meaning it to say.
Right.
I wasn't meaning it to say like this never happens. Just as a I've seen it sometimes.
Yeah, and it
And I
totally
think
is.
they're slightly crazy, but it's cool.
Yes, it's very cool. All right, so the other question was how resources for figuring out normal period paint color schemes. All right, so the best option for period paint color schemes, actually, and the real answer to this is partially is to spend a lot of time looking at medieval manuscripts, because the color scheme is going to change a little bit depending on what time period you're looking at and what country you're looking at, because they're all going to vary based on what they had available locally and what they could afford to import. Your best rule of safety is, could you have made it out of a rock, dirt, or a plant? If it's a modern mixed blended color, like an electric color or a neon or a super tealy, and now I want to say a super tealy blue-green, but those do exist in period in certain places, especially like Middle Eastern. I said earlier, I took an amazing class in Middle Eastern pigments from Mistress Elena With, the last time we had Winter Kingdom in person. And the fun thing I learned from her research was that they blended stuff, no matter how toxic it was, to get all sorts of cool colors. And they were brave and crazy and awesome. And so they had things like teal, which you don't see in most of the rest of Europe. You don't see a lot of actual natural oranges unless somebody had a really great dirt that made a really beautiful orange, or they managed to get it out of lead. Because again, you cook lead at different temperatures, different times, you get different colors. So the best thing for period color schemes is the more natural the colors look, the better off you generally are. The nice thing about a lot of the old traditional paint colors is, like with oil paints, they're named what they are. Like raw umber, burnt umber, like your dirts are literally named, is this a raw dirt or a cooked dirt? If its name is literally a dirt or a chemical, or that you would find on the periodic table, it's probably a natural color. If it's, there's a lot of good mixing, but just the things that look more natural are going to be your more period colors most of the time. Your purer colors are going to be more period. And I've done whole classes on just colors, but for example, if we want to look at some more of the things that I have in my box, since we have time, we've still got 10 minutes. I have a whole bunch of things in my box. Like when you're looking at yellows, like the yellow we consider Onsteoran yellow for the most part when you're looking for a good deep is a cadmium yellow. Let me pull up my camera. Cadmium yellow is that deep, dark, golden, almost slightly orange color that we call school bus yellow, is also what we end up using in Onsteora a lot, is a good deep cadmium yellow. That said, when I get to my cadmium deep, we talked about how different things come out different colors. The deep version of cadmium, this is a yellow, it's awfully orange looking. So like if you need an orange and you're like, but they didn't have orange, they probably had an orangey color. My cadmium red pale, this is that color that looks like orange on Celtic scrolls, because next to the darker cadmium red, you plot the full cadmium, if it'll open for me. I should put that upside down, it's closed on. The difference between the pale and the dark. This is a nice pure cadmium red. This is very much you could get a marker and it would be a red, right? It's a nice, almost Crayola red, but it's deep. This lighter red is very much a red, but the minute I put it next to this one, it looks very orange. And this is where you get a lot of that combination. They had a lot of the cadmium and the Celtic stuff, so that's why I'm using that as an example. But you could put these two reds on the same scroll, and it would look like you had red and orange. But these are all of these are made from cadmium. So because cadmium, and also like I said, when you cook lead, you can do this too. The cadmium is a little bit less toxic than the lead. But you get these lovely colors. For greens, I've got everything from a forest green, if I need a really dark, vibrant green, to some of the period greens. Let me show you some period greens. This is oxide of chromium. This is a period green. This is a completely period color. Then I also have sap green, was incredibly popular in the Middle Ages as a color, because sap is useful. This is also a very period green. If you're looking for lighter, brighter greens, these are great colors. This one's actually a little bit grayer in person than it looks like here, but it's a lovely, the oxide is great for like a mossy-ish color. Modern moss green and a lot of what we consider camo greens are blended greens, so they're not necessarily period colors. And sometimes even if they could make it, you want to, did they use it in a scroll? Because, not every color you make is something you would necessarily want to, turn into art. So they might have made colors and gone, this does not work for me. If they didn't use it, we don't know. But a fun one, also period, cypress green. Cypress green is fun because cypress green is about as close to a teal blue as you're going to get in a lot of the Mediterranean area. But this is a fun, I have used this green as a blue. It is in fact officially a green based on the amount of pigment and the style of the pigment. But if you put it next to an actual blue, let me pull out ultramarine. This is the cobalt. Ultramarine is the modern version of cobalt. This is our deep period. If you were using, what am I looking for? But this is like the really popular period blue. Ultramarine itself is a modern incarnation, but this is the color you're looking for the ornament. Yes. But this next to this, you can see why this is definitely greener. It's why I'm saying it's almost a teal, right? Because it would be a blended. It's greener than your blues. It's bluer than your greens. It's that fun middle color. So, but a lot of it's practice, and a lot of it's looking at what does this individual scroll use, and just getting the closest color you can to match it. I've built this pile of colors up over decades, so don't feel like you have to have all the colors at once, because there's a lot of them. And if you're not sure, you can always ask somebody. You can be like, I'm not sure if this color is period. Is it? Like if somebody ever like if you buy a set of paints and you want me to just come over and like mark which ones are period and which ones aren't, because you're like, I have no idea, I will bring a Sharpie and I will put little check marks on every one of them that's period and little X's on all the ones you don't want to use. You know, I've done this for people. I've done this on my own stuff where I'm like, well, that one's not period. That's period. Yes. Like, so if we're ever in person, I will happily mark every single period to even sometimes period color on your box for you. So you just know. Because when you're starting out, it's like, but there are so many colors. I mean, rule one, if it looks like it belongs on a disco floor, the answer is no. But avoiding obviously modern colors helps.
So bubblegum pink is not.
Right. And we say that, and yet occasionally. There are some really weird colors you see. If you love pink, look at late period Italian, because while they didn't do the pinks we have, they had a lot of pinks made from tinting white into their reds, which does not give you bubblegum pink, but it does give you a whole lot of lovely rosy and sometimes very vibrant colors that are in fact pinks. But you mostly see those in very late period, mostly the Italians. The Italians love them. And you're going to hear me say most a lot because like modern art, there are always exceptions to every rule. Because they're artists and no one's telling them they have to, you know, it's more of what's available than what, you know, it's like, oh, I want to try this, so I'm going to. But yeah, all right. Any other questions? These have been amazing questions. Y'all are great. If not, we are down to 4 minutes and I am done with the official lecture part of this class. I hope you got a lot out of it and are able to get supplies and get ready to have some fun.
So I'm looking at my box of colors,
Okay.
and there is light fastness, transparency, and pigment number. Do you know what any of those?
Okay, so light fast is how quickly does it fade
Okay.
in the sun. Transparency is transparent versus opaqueness, because even in a gouache, you're going to have, you know, watercolors, you know, we talked about earlier, those watercolors that you could, you know, you can see through it, you know, you get those watery effects are very transparent. Most gouache is going to be more opaque because of what it is.
Okay.
But depending on what it's made from, it still may have more transparency than others. For example, I have lovely alizarin crimson pigment. When I got my alizarin and mixed it up, not because it's not gorgeous, but because it is very translucent compared to almost every other gouache I've ever had. It is great for late period watercolory washy effects. It will not go dark for me no matter what I do. So to make up for that, I picked up cadmium. I found out that the Holbein brand, which is also a brand of gouache, they're an art company, had a cadmium red purple, which was therefore a little pinker. It's more of an alizarin crimson color, but it's opaque because it's cadmium. So I use this when I need it to look like alizarin crimson, but I need it to be opaque because the alizarin is more washy, which is great for like late period sunsets, but not fabulous for like some of the other stuff I wanted to do with it.
What about like several of the gouache that I have, it has like it's like pearlized. Like, did they ever mix metallics in with other colors to make a like almost a metallic-y blue, for instance?
So the answer to that, if you look on a medieval illuminated manuscripts, is generally no, because your gold is usually either leaf, which is a completely different process, or the leftover leaf used to make shell gold, which is when they crumbled it up and turned it into paint. So your metallics are, as far as illuminated manuscripts go, are separate.
Okay.
I haven't, if there's an exception to that, I have yet to see it. Like,
okay.
so I'm just gonna go with that. But like I said, they had golds, they had silvers, and you know, depending on where you are, your gold or your silver may be a little bit. But you don't see a lot of the other colors, which isn't to say that they aren't fun and occasionally useful, because we are the Society for Creative Anachronism, and if you use them carefully, Like I have this beautiful pearlescent silver gray color here at the end that makes amazing swords.
Lilith, I hate to interrupt you. The conversation is
The class is
incredible, but
over.
I do have another class coming in. So
Yes,
thank you
we're done.
everyone for your time. We appreciate it. Lilith, great classes.